Leon Trotsky and the Moscow Trials. The Moscow Trials were a series of fabricated trials that took place in the USSR in 1936, used by Joseph Stalin to seize political power from Leon Trotsky. These trials allowed Stalin to mislead the Soviet population and justify the execution of his rivals. His triumphant rise to power was Trotsky's tragedy, as the former leader was forced into permanent exile and eventually assassinated by Stalin's followers. Communism in Russia existed before the publishing of the Communist Manifesto, but only in very small numbers. When it was published in 1848 by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, communism developed a small illegal following. Over the years, that following expanded. Small revolutionary groups were formed, intellectuals began to study the writings of Marx, and by the late 19th century, there was a strong underground socialist movement. Leon Trotsky was born in the fall of 1879. In his autobiography, he refers to his childhood as the grayish childhood of a lower middle-class family spent in a village in an obscure corner where nature is wide and manners, views, and interests are pinched and narrow. His childhood experiences would serve to shape his left-wing ideologies for his entire life. In his teenage years, Trotsky acquainted himself with the works of Karl Marx, quickly growing more and more interested in the growing socialist ideology. In the year 1897, he would join his first revolutionary group, which would lead to his first political arrests. In 1900, he was exiled for the first time, and after returning, would lead a failed revolution attempt in 1905. Joseph Stalin grew up at about the same time as Trotsky, but their background shaped many of their differences in life. Stalin, unlike Trotsky, was born into Georgia, a poor country, into an even poorer family. He was exposed to harsh realities of violence, alcohol, and poverty very early in life, quickly turning him cold and emotionless. Like Trotsky, he became involved in socialist movements in his teenage years, but carrying with him a harsh background and a hatred for other authority. This led him to develop a more right-wing ideology than Trotsky's. With all this experience, Trotsky was very prepared when after 12 years of advocating for socialism, he finally got his chance to strike. He joined the rapidly growing Bolshevik Party led by Vladimir Lenin and managed to brilliantly lead the Revolutionary Army to victory in the Russian Civil War. The revolutionaries seized power from the monarchy and created a new socialist government. Taking all this into account, Trotsky became a very important leader in the country, often considered second only to Lenin in his standing. Stalin also involved himself in this movement and would become one of the political elite at the same time. Although they had to work together for the good of the country under Lenin, Trotsky and Stalin had fundamental differences in their ideologies. Stalin was much more authoritarian than Trotsky, meaning he was pro-bureaucracy, anti-democracy, and nationalistic. Trotsky was in many ways more anarchist than Stalin, being anti-bureaucracy, pro-democracy, and internationalistic. In fact, they only really agreed on the basis of socialism, both being anti-capitalism. Otherwise, they were extremely politically opposed, and Lenin was the glue holding them and their followers together for the most part. However, this was soon to change. After leading the Soviets for 7 years, and the newly established USSR for only 2, on the 21st of January in 1924, Vladimir Lenin passed away. Stalin immediately began to take over, hiding the documents written by Lenin that spoke out against him and his politics, and brainwashed a good portion of the Soviet public into believing he was Lenin's favorite pupil and ideal successor. This completely contradicted Lenin's final will that Trotsky would be the one to take over the USSR after his death, but most of the population was unaware of this, and Stalin began amassing political power to fully take over. Obviously, Trotsky was the biggest opposition to Stalin, and needed to be dealt with quickly. In the course of only 5 years, Trotsky was revoked his claim to be the USSR's leader, kicked out of his previous position, kicked out of the political elite, kicked out of politics, put into exile inside of the USSR, and then put into exile in Turkey. By the time 1936 came around, Stalin had almost absolutely cemented his rule, and Trotskyism was one of his final obstacles to complete control. Trotsky was at this point barely having arrived in Mexico, but he was soon to be slandered once again by the Stalinists, and the result this time would be catastrophic. The Moscow trials began in August of 1936 and would end by March of 1938. Leon Trotsky was named as the main defender in absentia and accused of treason, giving him little actual power over the proceedings of the trials. Over the course of the trials, Stalin's paranoia of a Trotskyist plot was on full display, as he accused just about any politician that didn't completely worship him of treason. Under his command, hundreds of politicians were tortured, blackmailed, and killed to force confessions of ludicrous plots. These include such confessions as letting food spoil to starve the Soviet people, counter-revolution against the Soviets, and ironically, even assassinating and betraying the wishes of Lenin. Worst of all, every one of these accusations was somehow tied back to Trotsky, and how these traitors were following his command, despite many of the accused not even being Trotskyists or siding with Trotsky. This continued for more than another year of genocide, purging, and inhumane treatment of politicians until Stalin was seen as a savior by many of the Soviets, and Trotsky, on the other hand, was seen by many Soviets as a despicable villain and a traitor. After the trials, Trotsky was tragically left in a state of permanent exile, with constant attempts to murder him for the remainder of his life. Despite the bleak situation, Trotsky still spent the rest of his days preaching his message to the international community, writing books about his life in the revolution, and trying to find some way to overthrow Stalinism and bring freedom to the oppressed Soviets. In 1940, Leon Trotsky was mortally wounded by a Mexican Stalinist agent, and died soon afterwards, to the shock and horror of the international communist community. After the trials and subsequently Trotsky's death, Stalin would remain the triumphant and undisputed leader of the USSR until his death in 1953. During this time, he further oppressed and murdered his people, oversaw horrible decisions during the Second World War and the beginning of the Cold War, and furthered his godlike status to the Soviet people, which would not be fully dismantled for decades. However, he was not in all ways horrible in his leadership, as one could argue his intense silencing of the people with the Iron Curtain helped the USSR to exist for as long as it did, and also being the main reason why the Allies finally managed to win the Second World War over the Axis. After Stalin's death, the government slowly tried to improve the world's perception of the USSR. The final leader of the USSR, Gorbachev, even tried to peel away the Iron Curtain the USSR used for so many years to hide the truth from their people. However, the USSR could not last forever, and when Gorbachev allowed the Soviets to see the truth, it came crumbling down. Overall, the idea of communism and socialism are still popular in the minds of people around the globe, but that's all it is, an idea. The era of socialist states is for the most part over, and will most likely not re-emerge for a long time. To Trotsky, the world's workerdom needed to unite under socialism to make world socialism work. But the international perception of Stalin's cruelty while he led the country kept socialism from blossoming into the bigger, international force that Trotsky envisioned.